Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're back here today with Mr. David Amerland, the author of immensely popular, even more popular than just about any book out there, book SEO Help. And we're going to have some special announcements and some special offers today later on. So it's going to be a little different than usual Hangouts. So we'll do that later on. But right now, we're going to be tackling the chapter 12 from the SEO Help book, which has to do with podcasts. And we'll go a little bit into the podcast idea, but first I want to bring David in and say hello, David.
Oleg, hi, how are you?
Pretty good, thank you. And I'm going to turn right back into my podcast mode. And so what are podcasts? Basically, most people know what they are. They're just essentially audio files. I mean, that's one easy way to look at it. And they have content that's audio content. There is no video, there's no text, just nothing but audio. And people started doing these podcasts in the beginning, way back actually. They were popularized in the beginning on the old iPod from Apple. And in fact, the name itself, iPod, POD, is part of, you can look at it as, because of podcasting kind of started because of that, because it was called iPod. And the cool thing about podcasts, obviously, the fact that you can listen to stuff is pretty cool. But the interesting thing about them is, and the reason they became popular is because there was a simple way, relatively simple way, to get an application. And of course, now they have these applications. You don't need to have an MP3 player like iPod used to be. You can now do this on your computers. You can do this on your phones, on your tablets, pretty much anywhere. And the format itself allows you to set it up so any RSS reader, which is something you use for aggregating information from various websites, if they can bring podcasts in as well. So now you can just subscribe to a RSS feed, and hopefully you know what that means. Once you subscribe to RSS feed, just like you get articles being sent to you, this way you're getting these audio files, these podcast files sent to you as well, which of course makes them very useful because there's tremendous variety of them. There's out there, people do podcasts on business, they do podcasts on cooking, on comedy, on news, just about any topic you can imagine. There's most likely at least one, but most likely more than one source that's doing podcasts on that particular topic. Now, the drawback of everybody and their brother doing podcasts, of course, is that you have such a tremendous wealth of stuff that, I mean, who has the time to listen to all of this? But the beauty is that you can definitely, over time, pick some real gems, because there's tremendous amount of articles out there about podcasts, top 10 podcasts of last year, best podcasts for business. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can search for, and you can actually listen to some of them. You don't have to subscribe necessarily. And then when you listen to them, then you can get some idea about whether you like the people who are doing them. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's teams. Some of them are very elaborate with music and sound effects and all kinds of stuff like that. Others are just plain old text where somebody gets in front of a mic and they just record whatever they're going to say. And of course, you can save them. In addition to being able to bring them in using RSS, where you can subscribe to what you like, and the new episodes, as they call them, just come in whenever they release them, and you can get notified that you have a new episode, you can listen to it. In addition to that, you can also have software that allows you to store them. So it's not like just they come in, you listen, and they're gone. You can actually listen to them as many times as you want. You can easily go to any previous episodes for that particular podcast. And you can also arrange things in categories, and you can have podcasts dealing with music or dealing with, like I said, news or cooking or whatever it might be. So from the business standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, because you can now, if you take the time to record some of these things, a lot of people wake up with bad hair days. I mean, a lot of people, especially, well, I shouldn't say especially, but a lot of people complain about having bad hair days. And then you have, of course, in addition to that, you have people who just have a face for radio, as they call it, like my face, for example. It was meant to be for radio. And if you think about it from that perspective, then the apprehension of being on video and having everybody see your whatever it might be, whether it's a pimple on your face or sweat on your face, whatever it might be, you're just feeling awkward. You're feeling bad. You don't want to be in front of the camera. So podcast is definitely a way to get your message out without this part of it being part of the mix, which makes you uncomfortable. So that makes it extra special for people who really are not into video. This is a much better format for them. And at the same time, they can get their message across by recording the audio part, which can be done using a very simple set of tools. You don't need to spend a lot of money to create podcasts. You've got simply, you need to have a decent quality microphone, which of course, there are plenty of those these days. You need to have some kind of software that allows you to record audio. For example, one example that comes to the top of my head would be a program like Audacity for PCs. And I'm sure they have all kinds of different podcasting software for Macs as well. And so you get a free piece of software essentially. You have a microphone that allows you to record, and then you just need to have the content itself, whatever you're going to record, and you record. You can make them 5 minutes long. You can make them 1 hour long, whatever your preference is, anything in between. And then you're sending you actually need to publish it. Just recording on your computer, nobody's going to see it. So you need to put it into one of these services that allows you to publish podcasts. And there's plenty of those, including even big guys like Google Music. You can put podcasts on iTunes. Now you have podcasts that you can get on Audible, which normally used to have just audiobooks. Now they have podcasts as well. So there's plenty of different outlets out there where you can actually publish and store your podcasts. And once that's in place, then of course you have people, and they have social component where people can follow other people so they can see what kind of podcasts they're listening to. People can subscribe to your podcast, and it kind of goes on and on. I don't really mean to get into a lot of details here about podcasts, because even though it's not that complicated, at the same time, you can really get into a lot of minutia. So if you have any questions specifically about any of these steps to create podcasts or find them or consume them, I'll be happy to do it. Just grab me on Google Plus or grab David, and we'll be happy to answer that. But today's discussion, I just wanted to kind of start with a little bit of information about podcasting, and then move right into the SEO component, which is obviously what David was writing about in chapter 12 of his SEO Help book. And before I turn it over to David, I wanted to say that podcasting is something that's both popular and very, very useful. I mean, I think I mentioned that already. But I also wanted to say that, now I'm losing my train of thought here, but of course you can't see me sweating because you don't see my face. So that's the point here. And no, there was another point I was going to make, but now it kind of eluded me. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David to talk about the SEO aspects of podcasting. And I'm going to turn my video back on. I just wanted to make a point about the fact that you're dealing with a medium where you have nothing but audio. In our case, we're doing the Hangout, obviously using video as well. But as you're listening to me, the only impressions you can get are audible ones, because there's nothing visually other than looking at my PCS logo. You're not really seeing anything else. And I did it intentionally to make a point about this is the experience, how you get podcasts, and the experience you're getting when you're listening to a podcast. Okay, with that, David, I will turn over to you.
So thank you. And I think everybody's worried that your screen wasn't working. But here's an important point. Okay, we're going to discuss the search engine optimization aspect of podcasting, which is a little bit weird if you come to think about it, because we're talking about what is essentially as close as we can get to radio on the web, and that impacts on search. But also, there are other aspects which we need to think about, and certainly the reason, the easy question here is why? Why would you even consider doing a podcast? I think the moment we start thinking about creating content, and remember, content throughout this series, and indeed throughout the book, is part of how you create part of your online identity. It is how you basically project the values which you share with your audience, and it is also how you connect with that audience in a shared space of ideas and the online conversation. So when we say why, Well, the answer there is fairly easy. Well, essentially, you're creating a parallel um, information and communication channel, if you like, which allows the audience to sample your content and consume it in a different way, in a different format, which better suits their needs. So if you're talking about podcasting, you got to think the audience needs, you got to think the people on the go. I think all of us at some point have left a YouTube video playing in the background while we're doing something, and then we have had to sort of jump back and forth between tabs because they have perhaps used a visual aid and they're referring to it, and we think, okay, we're missing out what's happening here, and we've got to go back. This is the imperfection of multitasking on video. Audio, on the other hand, seems to be perfectly suited to multitasking because essentially you're just listening to the spoken word. And there are a couple of things to consider here. If you're creating content in podcasts or audio, you have to think that essentially there are two choices you can have, or two paths you can go down on. One is the polished content, where you basically think very carefully about what you're going to construct. Perhaps you can put kind of music and high production values, and you create a kind of thing. Or you can go down the unfiltered path, where essentially you get almost a stream of consciousness of somebody talking. Both have pros and cons, but in creating either, you need to consider that the primary quality here is communication. So essentially, the spoken word is also pretty hard because there's nothing for people to remember in terms of visual reference. There's no way of them to go back easily and check what you said, as we do on the written page. And because there is no plurality of information channels, which we get normally in a visual medium like here, where I'm smiling, I'm using my hands and draws attention, I'm sort of capture your attention. I can make a dramatic gesture perhaps and make sure that there's a point which is coming across. But if I'm just using my voice, then I need to be able to structure the spoken word in a way that is easy to consume, easy to understand, and easy to remember. So if you're getting something really complicated across in a podcast, you need to think about it very carefully. You need to think about it perhaps a lot more carefully than you would in the written word, and certainly a lot more carefully than you would in a sort of video format. So this is a thing to bear in mind. Now that becomes harder if you go down the unfiltered path, where you open up your mic, you set up your recording equipment, and you just start talking. If you're really good at this, and this is your knack, perhaps you can do it without too much thinking. For me, usually, I have to work, whenever I create a podcast for either my website or, I'm in collaboration with somebody, I have to think about it very carefully because the spoken word needs to create sound bites, which are memorable. They sort of summarize the information, they capture the reader's attention, they create maybe an aha moment in their head. And then all that, which I'm going to sort of have to cover, needs to make sense. Rule of thumb, make your podcasts short, usually shorter than videos. We're talking about 10 to 15 minutes. If you are the only person talking, perhaps even shorter. I mean, I usually create podcasts which go up to 3 minutes, and that's it. That's my limit. And that is purposeful because it allows me to think very carefully about the content, boil things down into sound bites, structure that around a central point, and create an oral narrative which is easy for the reader for the listener to consume. These are just tips. So really, when you think about it, this is the hard work that goes before you start the podcast. Then if you ask, okay, why should I do it generally? Well, you should do it because you're reaching an audience which is usually harder to reach, people on the go, people on the move. You're reaching somebody perhaps in their car, you're reaching somebody when they're jogging, you're reaching somebody when they're walking, and you think, well, okay, great. Is it going to help my brand? Well, if you have their attention, yeah, it is. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're fighting for. You want people's attention. If you don't have people's attention, then you're not going to you're not going to be top of mind when it comes for them to make perhaps an actionable choice, like a purchase decision or promoting something which you have created, and so on and so on. So yeah, you do need to have that kind of contact. How does it help in terms of search? Well, there are two ways there, or maybe three. So let's look at them. First of all, the moment you have a podcast, you have a way of creating brand impact and social media noise and shareability and so on around your brand. All these are parallel signals, the tiny little signals which search definitely sees. It's activity which impacts on other elements of your brand, and in its totality, all this activity does actually help you in terms of search. It won't, however, give you the kind of thing where you say, well, I created a podcast and guess what? I'm on the first page of Google for something. Well, no, you're not. It's not quite like that. Now, the other thing which will help certainly, it gives you rich media content. Search engines are looking for that. Certainly, you have the ability to create rich pages on your website, which are rich in different kinds of media. You can have video, you can have podcasts, you can have perhaps specific podcasts or specific podcast page or specific podcast channel. And if you create also the text which goes around that, you can either have a complete transcript of your podcast, which creates a lot of search engine in terms of what the podcast is about, or you can introduce it, introduce the context and create a theme around it, which allows you perhaps to create additional layers. And the third way of looking at this, it's essentially this is data. So we know that search can actually listen to the spoken word. We haven't got quite yet to the point where everything is indexed in terms of podcasts, but potentially it could. And certainly, they can create an additional layer of indexed information, which directly now feeds into your brand and everything else which you do in terms of search.
Excellent. And of course, when you look at it from a standpoint of, what do you put in a podcast, it's no different than creating web pages. You create web pages as a content for this purpose of people getting some kind of value out of them. That's the general basic abstract view of why you're creating web pages. And so you can look at the podcast as a different medium, but essentially you're doing the same thing. You're trying to create some content that will give people value of some sort dealing with your business, whatever it might be. And so sometimes they say, pictures worth 1,000 words. It is. But in other cases, you want to describe something to people, and you can certainly describe something a lot quicker using audio, just talking like that, than having a bunch of text. So when that kind of stuff comes in, that makes more sense to have that. Another reason you might want to consider doing audio is because, and like David said, doing it shorter is a good idea, so you don't have to really get into this professional mode where you need to get everything perfect, or else, it's just like with doing videos. You don't have to be perfect. You just need to be decent in terms of quality. So the sound quality is the most important thing. I mean, if you scrub the sound quality, your podcast is going to be basically useless.
I think this is true for video as well, though, funnily enough, right?
Totally,
I mean, the
totally.
sound is key.
Exactly. But in video, you have to have sound be the most important part that needs to be right. But you also have to have the second part, which is video, that also needs to be right. So, if we do like, Gina was saying, that she got bored looking at my logo. Thank you, Gina. And she wanted to look at you. Clearly, with that being the case, you understand that the visual component plays an important role when you're doing video. We're doing video here, and so that's what Gina was expecting. Okay, and then when she looks at something else, if it's continuously the same thing in her face because she's expecting something visual and she doesn't get it, she gets bored. But maybe it's just Gina, I don't know. But seriously, seriously though, what I wanted to say was that for audio, when you're doing nothing but audio, like podcast, it's super important to have the audio done right in terms of quality of the audio itself. I don't mean the quality of the content, but quality of the audio. Then if you want people to listen to this over and over and over and keep coming back, which is obviously the name of the game for any kind of website, you want people to be able to come back and come back and come back. The only way that's going to happen is if the content you generate would be the content they're looking for. It's useful to them. So that's the key thing to figure out. That's why you should do some planning ahead of time. And then if you look at it from the SEO standpoint, David, correct me if I'm wrong, you can advertise these podcasts that are coming in as part of some of the web pages. So you're linking from web pages to these podcasts. And of course, the part about linking being on the web page winds up potentially being part of your SEO as well, depending what you put on that page. So essentially, you have a page that tells people where to go to get the podcast, how to subscribe to them, things like that, and also possibly a little bit about what they're about. So you're kind of, it's almost like a promo for that. And then of course from there, that winds up being indexed by Google. And then also it's a reason for people to come back because you're constantly putting new content there. Because it's kind of, in a way, you can think of it as a blog. You know, people keep putting things in the blog, people keep coming back because there's constantly new content. Websites are generally don't have that much content changing all the time. So blogs are much more conducive in terms of getting people to engage and come back and come back and come back because they're constantly changing. You can do the same thing with podcasts, and by having a web page that or multiple pages that promote your podcast, you wind up using that as SEO as well. Even though, like David said, you cannot. The Google right now doesn't really index every word. Maybe at some point they will, maybe they won't. But at least this way you can use it for SEO. You can't just tell people, you know, why don't you guys just come back to this page? I mean, that's not going to work. You need to give them something, a reason to come back. And one of the reasons, of course, is this podcast thing. So in the question of why would you use podcast versus using something else, again, like David pointed out, if you're going out jogging, you're not going to be looking at any kind of HOA when you're going jogging. You're not going to be looking at any HOA when you're driving a car, or unless you want it to be the last thing in your life that you're going to be seeing.
Yes.
So the idea there is now you've got something you can give them that they can actually utilize while they're doing these other activities. So it becomes, it's not a competition to whatever you're doing in video or text or web or anything else. It becomes a complementary thing. And you don't want to be putting exactly the same content necessarily. Although some people do that. They actually strip HOA audio and they drop it in as a podcast. That's another thing that definitely I've seen people do. You know, and nothing wrong with that also. So you kind of have to think about different ways of how you can publish this information to people and use the SEO parts. And then when you actually create content, that's why I would not recommend doing it simply by stripping HOAs, because like we're having a discussion here, and you can see my hands flying a little bit. You can see David's hand flying, you know, here and there, and you know he laughs and this and that. It's a different thing when you see it visually, like you're looking right now, or you know I'm looking at your face, you're looking at my face, hopefully, Gina. And at the same time, you know, it's a certain feeling that gets generated by doing it this way. When you're doing audio only, then any of these gestures or any of these facial expression, anything, they're gone completely. So when, you know, if you're talking about something, you say, you see this, you take, you know, you take this bottle here, and you know, I'm holding the bottle, and basically you can see the design and everything else. So you have this kind of conversation going on. They can't see. In HOA you can see it, but if I'm doing it, if I'm talking about, you know, the bottle, even though it's a very nice looking bottle, and you know, it's got all these features on it, and it's totally biodegradable, and so on and so forth, you can't see anything. You can't see anything. You can't say. So keep in mind when you're creating content for podcasts that you want to keep that in mind, that your audience will only be listening to this. And you know, I think from SEO perspective, you can get creative a little bit. I think with SEO in terms of having these additional web pages to work with your podcasts, and you know, it ends up being a nice synergy. David, do you agree?
I do certainly think there are a few additional points to make to this, and I think Gina made one very easily. Essentially, she said she wasn't prepared for the, you know, she came to see visuals. And I think when we talk about creating content, one of the things which we're looking at is engagement with the audience, and certainly a video connection like a Hangout on Air makes that very easy because we're connecting with a person. There's a lot of sort of redundancy in the communication channel, which allows that connection to be made very easily and very directly. It's a lot harder to create direct engagement through a podcast. It is structured in a different way, and it's also designed to be consumed in a different way. You know, you can consume it quite passively. You're doing something else in the background, you're playing this. You mentioned driving, for instance, or jogging, or, you know, doing some other work which doesn't require a tremendous amount of concentration. I think podcasts are ideally suited for that kind of connectivity with the audience, and it's another parallel stream of interaction, which is perhaps less intensive in terms of attention, but it allows quite a lot of depth in terms of the accompanying emotions, the ideas that generate in a very directed way, and also the more structured way of the podcast allows us to perhaps clarify certain points which in a video environment can become lost or become very diffuse because we have so much more additional information and a lot more noise.
Yeah, and I think also when you create these podcasts, I think what you can do also in them to go to David's point about engagement is there's nothing wrong with pointing people, audibly to go somewhere. So, for example, let's say we're talking about the SEO Help book and what it has and things like that and all of that. Nothing wrong with making a comment that you can get the SEO Help book at davidamerland.com. Just go to the website www.davidamerland.com to get the book. And so what you end up having this way is by your number one, you're promoting your website, which is always a good thing. Number two, you're giving people a path how to engage with you. In other words, yes, you cannot have them engage with you using audio in the middle of them jogging, but at the same time, if you give them the URL several times throughout the audio, this particular hangout right here, for example, is sponsored. We're going to have some things from SEMrush, company that well, David will go into more detail about what the offer is, everything else. But the bottom line is sponsored by SEMrush. By the way, if you guys don't participate in this SEMrush offer, you're not going to get any value. You're going to forget everything you're hearing here. There's not going to be any value. So you have to give some love to SEMrush because they're giving us some good stuff here. But seriously, though, that's the kind of stuff that you can do. Is if you're dealing with companies, if you're dealing with your own company, you can provide information about the company, including the URLs, and that way audibly ask people to get back to you, to engage with you. Maybe it's some kind of offer and you're telling them where to go, which website to go to get this offer, and something like that. So there's definitely a way to create engagement by asking people to engage. It's going to be not engaged directly during the time when they're listening to this podcast necessarily, because they may be driving and so they can't do it. But you can still get around it using this other approach. And another thing I wanted to mention before getting David back in here is, people create podcasts with music and some background music and, trying to make it sound like a radio show or TV program or things like that, so it's a little bit more professional and so on and so forth. The thing not to lose focus on, just like doing flashy websites, it's about the quality of the content you provide and the need for it. That should be the most important thing. One of the very prominent people on Google Plus, for example, which we're not mentioning any names here, but it's a gentleman that I actually have a lot of respect for what he does in the company that he is working for and things like that. He put out a podcast at one point. He tried and he stopped. I don't think it resonated with people too much. And one of the things that was happening in that particular podcast is very loud music in the very beginning. Okay, and kind of like heavy metal type stuff, not just loud, but heavy metal stuff at much higher volume than the volume of the podcast itself. So that you could tell it's almost like listening to TV ads. You listen to a show, it's a normal volume level. All of a sudden, advertising comes in, you can hear it. Why is it so loud? Because they intentionally do it this way to wake people up from whatever they're doing and look at the ads. And so this gentleman was also doing the same thing here, same concept. Get the loud music in the beginning for a little bit, and then move into his podcast part, and then at the end, again, basically was this trailer that was also the same loud music. I listened. I liked the content quite a bit, but it really, even though I listened all my life to loud music and I like certain kind of music and so on and so forth, it was just basically, it's like it just rubbing me the wrong way. I just could not listen to that music. It just was bugging me. So after listening to one of these podcasts and then another one, I kind of started looking back and thinking that this thing is really bugging me. So you have 3 minutes of content, which was good content, but this thing in the beginning and the end just bugs the heck out of me. And so I actually reached out to the gentleman saying that maybe you might want to kind of change it around because because of this effect that it has on some people potentially. I got a reply from him saying that he thinks it's a good idea. He likes the concept behind it, and he kind of likes this music, so he's going to go ahead and go with it. Well, the end result of it was I stopped listening to these podcasts, specifically because it was just bugging me too much. Yes, the content was good, and like I said, I do admire the guy for his savvy and wisdom and everything else. Nothing wrong there. I just could not get myself to listen to this snippet of music in the beginning and the end for every one of these 3-minute deals, and so I just stopped listening completely. And so you have to be cognizant of that when you create podcasts, that there's different kinds of people. You know, people are people. I always say that. So some people like classical, some people like jazz, some people don't like anything. So you cannot, for example, eliminate your accent. You know, if I was doing podcasts, there's nothing I can do to get rid of my accent. I cannot get rid of the text itself, the content itself, because that's the whole idea of podcast. You have to create the content. So the audio part, you have to record. You do the best job you can, fine. But in terms of these embellishments, if you want to have like backtrack music playing, be careful so it's not too loud to basically fight with your voice. So people listen, they can't tell. It's bad enough that you may have an accent if you're like me, but at the same time, if the volume is so high on the music, the backtrack, that it overpowers to some degree what you're saying and they can't understand it, it's useless. It's totally useless because they can't understand what you're saying, so you're wasting their time. So they're not coming back. They're not listening to your podcast. Nothing is happening there. And at the same time, the actual music itself, you know, even though, like I said, you're trying to create a little branding, all that, I totally understand that. My advice would be do not do this, okay? Because there's going to be some people who object to it, and you don't really want to alienate anybody. You want to present your content. If they want to listen to it, they will. If they don't, they won't. But you don't want to kill and sabotage your own efforts by sticking to this kind of approach. Well, I'm going to have my own brand, and if it doesn't have Metallica in it, it's just not happening. I would not recommend doing that. David?
A lot of good points there, definitely. You know, throughout this series, we have said a few things which keep coming up again and again. And I think it's important to sort of highlight them now, particularly with podcasts, because they are a faceless sort of way of communicating and connecting. And, you know, they can go wrong very easily. Okay, here's a couple of things. I mean, Oleg mentioned voice and accent, and I think these are important. We live in a world where unfiltered, authentic have value, and we shouldn't get too hung up on this, as long as the communication level is actually at quite a high level. And this is what we need to get across. There's absolutely nothing wrong with communicating with somebody in a particular accent. And you know, not too long ago, at the beginning of the century, I was in a panel where we looked at regional BBC accents and whether they were acceptable or not. And that was back in Manchester. And you know, the question was, you know, would a Northwest accent from a presenter on the BBC would be acceptable at the national level, or should it be regional, or you know, should he have perhaps, you know, elocution lessons to bring him up to the standard of received pronunciation? It was, you know, totally beyond belief in retrospect, but it was actually quite a valuable question and exercise at the time, because the voice and the accent of a particular presenter come along with certain preconceptions and misconceptions about them, and that can become a barrier to communication. Thankfully, we have got a little bit further along that conversation. So these are not as much of a problem as they used to be, provided, of course, that there's a demonstrable value to the level of communication and to the points which are being communicated. And that's how we judge these things these days. Certainly, you have to take it into consideration. You have to think, well, is it going to work against me or not in a particular context? You know, we do get beyond prejudices, we do get beyond sort of misconceptions about these things, but at a human level, that still exists as a filter, and you need to work extra hard to make sure that the human connection is actually made to the point that it becomes irrelevant. Now, within this context, I will show you a direct example of how powerful podcasts can be in actually eliciting the kind of communication. Now, in the States, there's an organization called Pop-Up Magazine. They have a website, popupmagazine.com. And what they do essentially is they bring journalists and experts from different forms of media together, and they actually present a narrative on stage. So although it's a magazine, it happens on theater, it is not recorded, so it is perishable, and that sort of drives engagement with the audience very directly, and you have to go to those that you have to pay a ticket, because essentially what you take away with you is nothing recordable, nothing printed, nothing which you have on tape or anything like this, but what is in your head. So essentially they help broaden your mind, create ideas, and so on. They also
Okay,
have
there. Oh,
yeah,
sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, now essentially they have taken this to a different level, and they now also have podcasts, which are accessed through the web and certainly through your phone. And again, it creates a kind of experience through the recorded medium. And now we just have voice, right? So they have a very structured approach to continuing the stage impact of their presentation through the parallel medium of the podcast, because exactly it is so powerful. At the same time, it allows passive consumption by the audience at a moment of their choosing, so they're in total control while they're doing something else. So, they have done it in a very considered way, and it is working really well for them.
Okay. And speaking of accents, я могу прекрасно говорить с вами просто по-русски, тогда у меня никакого акцента не будет, и все понятно тем, кто может говорить по-русски. Но, с другой стороны, некоторые люди не говорят по-русски, поэтому получается немножко тяжелее. So another point I wanted to make is, I can still speak without an accent, it just happens to be a different language. And that's something that also you should consider, that if you do have ability to have a multilingual capability where you can speak another language, that's something to consider to also do, because if your audience happens to have people who speak something other than English, even though I love English and I don't have any problems doing everything in English, at the same time, I can also speak Russian, for example. So if I do something for, let's say, Russian community or people, there's enough people in the audience I'm trying to have that speak Russian, then it makes sense to also not just do the podcasts in English, but also do them in some other languages too. Obviously, we have in the States here, we have plenty of people who speak Spanish. Obviously, around the world, you have people who speak French and German, all these other languages too. So if you do have ability, you or anybody around you, and it makes sense for your audience to be able to listen to the same content in other languages, then you might want to take time to record in those languages and expand your audience that much more. So that's also something to consider about podcasts, is to do multiple languages. Before we proceed here, Scott asked a question. With speech-to-text engines, it's easy to get a mediocre transcript from a podcast, meaning lots of errors. Can we still get SEO benefits from such transcripts? And if so, then how?
It's an excellent question. The short answer to this is yes, definitely. There is value in using perhaps a speech-to-text transcription and getting the transcript, imperfect as it may be, of the podcast, because it still allows a search engine to look at it. It understands it's a transcript. There is a certain amount of error which is expected within that, and it is used on, if you like, an advisory basis, which allows the contextualization of the podcast. So let's say, for instance, we have a web page, as Oleg suggested earlier, where we have a podcast, we have a title, we have a date, and we have a brief paragraph of introduction. Well, as far as search is concerned, this is a drop in the ocean. It's very tiny in terms of how it fits in. If there's not a lot of activity around it, if there's not a lot of perhaps sharing of that web page, a lot of comments, a lot of sites linking to it and referring to it, it becomes very difficult for search to actually understand the importance of this particular page and how it fits in the overall scheme of things. So perhaps it could be surfaced in reference to a search query. Have text on it, however, which allows a deeper understanding of it, and that definitely becomes a step in the right direction in terms of helping a search engine understand the content of the podcast and the context of it, and certainly its importance. So that is a very good thing. Always bear in mind that the human user who lands on a page and looks at it is always put off a little bit sometimes. by imperfect transcripts from voice to text. And sometimes you can get quite sort of error, sort of, I was going to say hilarious errors, but not always. I mean, they can be pretty difficult to sort of get right, where words which shouldn't appear there, and that can become a problem. But this is something to look out for. Certainly, it is certainly a tool to use. It's a judgment call. It depends. If you have a site which is really slick, you've put a lot of effort to creating a very high quality brand, a very good user experience. Well, then, if you have a kind of transcript that is poor, that will work against you. If you have a site which is, I was going to say rough and ready a little bit in its appearance, it has not a polished effect, and the real values of the site is in the content, and that content really resonates with the audience, well, then I think you can get away with pretty much anything. So, it's a kind of judgment, which leads us back to identity, brand, and understanding of the audience. So, if you have a slick site and you present that to your audience, well, then you're taking a shortcut, and you're cheapening the effect. If you have a site which is, let's call it, very sort of direct and to the person who will access it of great value, and it's a little bit rough around the edges, but that's okay. Well, then, that's part of the authenticity, perhaps, if you like, and the audience are prepared to forgive you for it.
Okay, one thing I wanted to add, which is a little bit kind of, some of you may consider it crazy, but it's a unique approach which you might want to consider. That I was just thinking as I was listening to David and looking at Scott's question. If you're talking about getting an existing podcast that somebody else did that you're listening to and doing the speech to text thing, then everything David said, it's exactly what it is. But if you're talking about creating your own podcast, something that you record, and you want to be able to have a transcript of that, then one thing you could do these days, I don't know where we stand. One thing you can do these days is you can actually use kind of an advertised approach, which should work really well. And what it will work two things. Number one, you use the Audacity, for example, to record your voice, whatever the podcast is going to be. You're recording your voice using Audacity. But at the same time, what you're doing, you're creating a Google Doc, and you're turning on the voice typing, which is something that they've not only implemented, but also perfected to a large degree, that does an excellent level of understanding in terms of transcription, and you can use commands to format everything else. But in this case, the important thing is just voice typing itself. So what you could do is you can turn on Audacity to record audio, and at the same time, you turn on voice typing in Google Doc, and then you record your podcast, right? So it'll record the audio version into Audacity, while at the same time, all of your text and everything that you were saying winds up being dumped into this Google Doc, which then you can subsequently put in a blog, you can put on your website, you can put it wherever you want. Beauty of it being that it's something that's done automatically for you, and you get the automatic transcription, and you only do this once, and you have both the audio version and you have the text version. So I think that might be a good approach to do something like this. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I think that is definitely something worth considering. Again, I think it's also something which you need to look at. I mean, as a way of getting the spoken word transcribed, it can definitely work. As the overall experience goes from an audience point of view, again, this is something which needs to be looked at. If you think it's going to jar with your audience, then you don't do it. If you think that your audience will appreciate it, or they won't mind doing this kind of leaping around, then that's fine.
Yeah, but I just mean the concept about just recording the audio part and immediately having a transcript all ready to go. I think there's definitely some value in there.
Well, certainly, but I think generally, if you're going to record something, unless you're going for the totally unfiltered experience, or you are extremely experienced yourself and can speak in a very structured way, it is always worth writing it out, checking it, reading it aloud, listening for how it sounds, listening for how easy it is to remember, making the changes, and then you have a transcript ready anyway.
Right, but for a lot of people, it's easier to just simply talk and kind of off the cuff and things like that. we being professionals, professional broadcasters, we always do a lot of prep before we do these things, you and I. But
Yes.
if you're looking for people who are not such professionals, no, just seriously though, a lot of people do prefer kind of off the cuff, on the fly deal. Plus, it's more intuitive and it looks actually more genuine. If you do something that's prepared, where you're doing the, teleprompter deal, track and analyze business information, gain insight. I mean, it just doesn't sound right.
Well, I think we need to clarify something here. I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely right in terms of video. That's its charm. Okay, we certainly don't want to, however much preparation we get into before we actually get into and hang out on air. What really makes it attractive, it's this kind of rawness where you see the person behind the brand, if you like. But
Right.
when it comes to podcasting, I think there you need to be really professional, not perhaps in the production value so much, but certainly in the structure of the spoken word. There's certainly a technique to it. It has to have a very much more simplified way of doing it, because remember, your audience is not sitting there glued to your listening. If they want to do that, they go and watch a video. So really, they're going to be doing something else. They're going to be typing. They're going to be, perhaps, answering emails. They're going to be driving, all sorts of things. So they're listening with only half a mind, which then makes it imperative that clarity, focus, and the points, the strength of the points which are being communicated is of paramount importance. That doesn't come easy. We need to be able to structure it in a way that makes sense. It creates a narrative that's easy to follow. It's quick. If they miss something, they don't feel they have to go back. If they miss an important point, they don't have to think, oh, I missed this and this is absolutely critical. So that takes work. And, I think the rough and ready approach on podcasts, because sometimes they're easy to do, you think I'm going to turn on my mic and talk, is exactly where a lot of people are actually going wrong. And this is one of the reasons that podcasts themselves haven't taken off in a huge way, although perhaps they should. The potential is certainly there.
Yeah, for those who are wondering what the UK definition of mic is, it's the same thing as we say mic, just so you know.
Yes, yeah, that is correct. Absolutely.
But I wanted to, I'm not trying to contradict you or anything, but I just wanted to add a point about what I was saying, is that I'm not advocating doing off-the-cuff thing without any editing afterwards, because you will make mistakes. And if you want these mistakes to come through, then you just release it as is. As David pointed out, definitely not a great idea. I mean, you're diminishing your own quality of your brand by doing this kind of stuff. So editing afterwards is almost a mandatory thing. But you can still record everything, and then just kind of, if you start and something goes haywire, then you restart again. It's okay, because you're going to be editing afterwards. And so you just can get rid of some of these snippets that were no good. So definitely not advocating, that you don't do any audio editing. You definitely can do it. And if you use a program like Audacity, it has it right built in. You can cut things, you can do all kinds of different things with that. So editing is definitely a good idea. But my point was that if you do create some sort of website where you're talking about your podcast, you can actually have transcripts of those podcasts in place. And then those transcripts, of course, will get indexed by Google as text, which means that if you put in there content that would be SEO friendly, so it's not just text, it's actually SEO friendly text, then I think there's a beneficial value in doing what I said about getting these transcripts in place, because A, you're giving people additional place where they can simply read. So, people who do not want to listen and they want to get the content, then they just simply read it. So I think there's definitely some value for some people there. And secondarily, is because it would be text, then you have you have then Google coming in to index it. So there's SEO value in that as well. So I think using this voice typing, because it's so good now, the Google Docs voice typing is phenomenal in terms of, if that thing practically understands just about everything I say with my accent, it's tremendous in terms of what they've done. So you still have very high quality speech to text capability. It's done automatically for you, so you don't have to be typing or anything else. So if you're the kind of person, like David mentioned, that you should be preparing ahead of time by writing things out, and especially when you're thinking of SEO, it makes it even more important to think about what it is that you're trying to say that would be SEO friendly. So it makes sense to go ahead and write it out, and then you'll be just reading most of it or some of it, or using it as notes, whatever you want to do, but essentially you already have text there. But you know, some people, hello Gina again, like to write stuff by hand using paper. They don't like to type stuff. Okay, and so for those people, it would make it that much more work to take that written text and get it into computer form. I mean, get it into text so it can be put on the website. So I think using this voice typing approach, you're eliminating any kind of problems with that in terms of doubling the work, because even if you write it by hand and then you simply start saying it to record it, you can have the document automatically have the text be going in as typing, so you don't have to type it manually. It's just something to consider, something to try. That's all.
Definitely, absolutely.
Okay. With that, I think we're coming to the end of our session here on podcast. And David has a special announcement from
I have, yeah.
SEM. I'm sorry?
Yes, absolutely.
From SEM Rush. And David, please tell us a little bit about what SEM Rush, the company, does and what the offer is, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Well, essentially, for those who don't know, semrush.com, they are an analytics company. They have a whole lot of easy to use analytics tools which webmasters use to check sentiment on the web around their brand, brand impact, brand reach. We look at perhaps what kind of search terms are associated with the brand itself and so on. So they are a way that people can reach the brand itself. Oh, thank you, that's really cool. They have kindly partnered up with me for a few weeks to offer SEOHelp.com as so SEO Help the book as part of the upgrade in their accounts, and they have also offered the opportunity for you guys to check out their accounts and actually have a free account for a couple of weeks. So what's going to happen in Google Space, we're going to share a link which will lead to an account. That account will basically be activated for you. It's a full account for 2 weeks. You can test drive it, see how it works for you. It has, I think, instructions on how to use it and so on, but it's fairly intuitive. So you actually get a feel for it. And they also had a small message, which perhaps I can screen share. And just so they can see the people behind it. So I'm just going to try and do this. Just give me a second. Okay, here we go. And I don't know if the sound is going to come across, so let's give it a shot.
By the way, if you're wondering, folks, this delay here was intentional, just so you know.
Okay, here we go. Hold on a sec.
No sound, but we know the main goal.
Oh, it's a shame because
It's one of the
okay.
drawbacks of Hangouts, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's no sound. All right, I'll share the message on you know, I'll upload the video on. It's a very short one.
In fact, you can, if you want, you can drop it right into space, David.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. Exactly. Yeah, and I thought about that. Yeah. And exactly. They're really cool guys. I mean, they couldn't make it because of the time zone. They, you know, they tend to sleep.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Which we don't. Anyway, so but you know, they have basically very kindly set up those accounts, and it's really worth trying. You know, I don't promote many things, or hardly anything really these days, but it is actually really cool, and I have a lot of affinity for them because of what they do and the way they do it, and it is very helpful. And obviously, I tried their accounts myself, and I do find them very useful.
Right. So basically, to reiterate, you know, you're going to get a code which will enable you to go and get to use their tools in their full 100% functionality form. It's not any kind of you know, limited deal or anything like that. You can use it for a full 2 weeks period. The only thing to remember is that you need to activate it within the next 2 weeks, and then you can use it for up to 2 weeks after that. So now you have this 2 week span at which point you need to start your evaluation, and then you have ability to evaluate for 2 weeks. And then if you actually start using their services and upgrade, then at that point you will get a free SEO help book. And if you already have a SEO help book, then you get another one.
You'll have a second one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
so
You
definitely
can't have
check
too
it
many
out.
of these, really.
No, exactly, yeah. Definitely check it out. And by the way, David, are the books printed or the digital?
It's digital. Everything, the moment you do it, it'll actually, they give you a digital copy,
So you
which
see,
is,
the pages will never get worn out. You get a book that's going to be in pristine condition, for the rest of your grandkids' life. So it's a really
yeah.
good deal. So with that, like David said, we'll put it in the space. If you haven't joined the space, then we recommend, David, can new people join the space, or we're going to shut it down? What's the plan?
No, let's allow new people to join it
Okay.
for this
So if you're
particular one.
listening to this and you're a new person and you have ability to still join the space, by all means. If you're listening and you can't join it, then you can't. We'll leave it at that. So David, anything else you want to say in conclusion before we wrap it up?
I'm going to say that podcasts can be a little bit daunting because not everybody thinks they can do them, but I think you should definitely try. It's the kind of thing that expands the way you think about your brand. It certainly is an additional layer of content creation that you should explore. And sometimes you just find the kind of audience which you hadn't expected to find before. And I think that's always a positive thing.
Yeah, and I'll say one last thing I'll say at the end also that we didn't touch on is, if you have something that really truly resonates with people, which may not be even about your business, it may be something, I don't know, you have a passion for whatever, chocolate candies. So you're doing a podcast on chocolate candies, even though you fix shoes for a living. Doesn't really matter. If you're doing a podcast, something that people really like, you may not necessarily tie it to your business, or you may tie it to your business depending on the situation. But one thing is that if the podcast become popular, and there's a lot of podcasts that people definitely listen to and they are popular, then the next thing that may happen is you have fairly decent audience, and you can tell using these software tools that how many people listen, download, subscribe, all of that kind of stuff. You can actually potentially turn it into a moneymaker too by selling advertising and having promos. In this case here, SEMrush is not paying us anything for this promo. We're just kind of doing it as part of the deal with David's book. But there's plenty of people who do these podcasts when they have, like this week in the Twitch show, which is a very popular technology podcast. It's been there for years, which stands for This Week in Tech. They also have Twig, This Week in Google. There's a bunch of different things they do. These people definitely make money on their podcast because they have all these sponsors that come in and pay them money to advertise their product. Maybe it's a company that sells headphones. Maybe it's a company that sells speakers. Maybe it's a company that sells flash drives. It doesn't really matter what it is. Bottom line is it's technology-related podcast, so they're actually advertising technology-related products, and these companies are happy to be their sponsors. So this is something you can also consider, that if you're good at doing this thing for a particular niche or a particular topic, then it also could be a way for you to make some money as well. Okay, I think we're done. So with that, let me just quickly double check to see if we have any more questions. And I don't see any here. Let me just see real quick in the questions area. Scroll down to questions. And okay, just the same question, Scotty. So nobody has any questions. Excellent. Then we must have covered everything perfectly. So again,
I think that's pretty cool.
Thank you for watching. We've got the offer is going to be in the space, Google Space, accompanying this particular HOA. I want to thank immensely, certainly people from SEMrush for providing this. And as always, huge thanks to David for doing this and bringing all this goodness from his book. If you don't have the book, listening to this, definitely get it at www.davidamerland.com, amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com. Any bookstore that sells good books will have David's book. He's also the author, I didn't say in the beginning, of 9 other books. So there's plenty of books you can buy from him. He publishes constantly on Google+. He publishes on LinkedIn. Basically, you can get in touch with David easily. You can get all of his stuff easily. But probably the best place to go for all of that would be davidamerland.com. with that said, David, thank you. I think we're done.
Thank you. That's absolutely great. Thank you.
And goodbye, everybody. Thank you for coming today. People who were joining us live today. Appreciate it, Scott, Zara, Gina. Certainly appreciate you guys coming today. Till next time when we do chapter 13, step 13. Thank you. Bye.